Okay, good afternoon and welcome to our final session of the day here in Spot 5 at NCEA 2021. This session is entitled Leading with Anti-Racism in Mind. Here with us today are three fantastic presenters, Clintel Hassan from Liberated Consulting, Taylor Kelly from the Alliance for Catholic Education at the University of Notre Dame, and Betsy Rafferty with St. Malachi's School, which is an independent mission school in Philadelphia. So thank you for joining us here. We invite you to actively engage with this presentation using the messaging function in the event platform. At the conclusion of the session, you'll have an opportunity to complete a post-session evaluation and provide feedback that will also track your participation in our sessions. If you run into any problems, we invite you to refresh your page, use the help section on the event platform. Lots of resources here to help you out. So Clintel, Taylor, Betsy, thank you so much for joining us, and we will turn it over to you three to begin.
Thanks so much, John. I'm a school leader, so I can't start something without starting my stopwatch too. So I started my stopwatch and we're ready to get rolling. John, thank you so much for the introduction. NCEA, thank you so much for having us today. And all of you, thank you so much for joining us. We're so grateful and humbled that you're joining us here today. I was looking through the list of folks who are going to be with us today and saw so many familiar names. So I'm so glad that you're here, and so many new names that I'm really grateful that you are here, took a chance on us to be with us today. I'm Betsy Rafferty. I'm an assistant principal here in Philadelphia, PA. And the reason that I'm here, the reason that we wanted to do this session, that we brought this forward for NCA is because it matters. It's really, really important. It's being the school leader of a Catholic school is kingdom work, and anti-racism is kingdom work. And this is the work that we're called to do right now. I am not an expert in this. I am not here as an expert. I brought some experts with me, but I am not an expert in this field. And I'm not here to be an exemplar. I'm here to be an example and to open my practice up to you with the idea that perhaps by participating with us today and going through our reflection, that it spurs in you some ideas, some dialogue that we can keep in touch after this and continue to push ourselves and push one another and really work together to do this kingdom work.
And who we are. And so good afternoon, everyone. I am Clintel Hassan. I am the co-founder of Liberated Consulting. We do anti-racist and culturally relevant pedagogy training and professional development for schools and nonprofits across the country. And I'm excited to be here.
Great. And like John mentioned, my name is Taylor Kelly. I serve as the Associate Program Director of ACE Advocates, which is our network of graduates and friends of the Alliance for Catholic Education at Notre Dame, and really grateful to be with you all this afternoon. So to further frame kind of who the three of us are and how we got to be together on this Zoom call today, really came from a collaboration between ACE and Liberated that stemmed from a connection that Betsy was able to provide us with back in the summer. And so ACE and Liberated collaborated on a series of diversity, equity, and inclusion training sessions for our graduate network that we were really blessed to work together on and to have our graduates grow with this topic of leading with anti-racism in mind. And the reason that collaboration started really stemmed from both of our missions. As many of you might already know, the mission of ACE is to sustain, strengthen, and transform Catholic schools. And that mission we really are always actively inviting people into because we believe in the power of Catholic schools and their power to help our students, our faculties, our staffs to grow in that image of Christ that we all so deeply align with. And because we believe in that necessary factor of our Catholic schools to grow as followers of Christ, we know that as followers of Christ, we cannot remain indifferent to suffering and injustice that exists in our world. And so it only seemed logical and fitting to collaborate with Liberated and in their own mission and work of building conscious leaders and as better leaders in this work of leading with anti-racism in mind. So I think whenever we come to this work of thinking about growing as anti-racist educators, as anti-racist leaders, it's first important to come with the acknowledgement from a place of contrition of times that we have fallen short in this regard, and especially as Catholic educators, of times where our church has fallen short in this mission of building up the kingdom of God here on earth. But I think we can also come to this work from a place of deep hope. And that hope comes first from knowing who we are as Catholics and as educators. And as Blessed Thea Bowman said, this hope also comes from knowing whose we are, that we as Christians, as Catholics, belong to Christ. And because we belong to Christ and because we believe that he came to end suffering and injustice in our world, that we can take deep hope in this work that we are doing. So with that, I'm going to turn things back over to Clintel to kind of frame some norms for our conversation today.
So in any time when you're really engaging and learning together as a group, particularly around difficult conversations such as race or oppression, power and privilege, it's always important to set the stage around some norms or expectations of how everyone in the space will engage. The ones that Liberated often uses are the courageous conversation norms that are originally developed by Glenn Singleton in the book Courageous Conversations About Race. And those norms are experience discomfort. And so this norm acknowledges that discomfort is inevitable, especially in dialogue about race, and that participants make a commitment to bring issues into the open. It is not talking about these issues that creates divisiveness. The divisiveness already exists in society and in our schools. It is through dialogue, even when uncomfortable, that the healing and change can truly begin. The next norm is expect and accept non-closure. This agreement asks participants to hang out in uncertainty and not rush to quick solutions, especially in relation to racial understanding, which requires ongoing dialogue. Whenever you're learning in a diversity, equity, and inclusion space, know that learning will not only happen in that space and is intended to occur outside of the space as well. Defenses down. This one is really about being open and vulnerable in sessions and in your learning. Really try to listen to what others are saying, particularly if those comments are directed at you as a leader or someone in a position of power. Really try to have your defenses down and listen to what is being said by participants. And then finally, fully engage. Staying engaged means remaining morally, emotionally, intellectually, and socially involved in the dialogue.
Thanks, Clintel, and thanks, Taylor, for the intro. So we're going to ask that you just take a moment to set the stage for yourself, to be present in this moment. If you are someone who thinks with your hands like I do, find a writing utensil. Take 5 seconds, find a writing utensil. Find a piece of paper if you like to write as you're learning. Take a minute to just clear the deck in terms of your space. Control your space, turn your phone on silent, close out your emails. There's so much we cannot control, but we can control our workspace. So take a moment to clear your deck. And we'll just take a mindful moment. I'm gonna count to 10 as we take a deep breath. Or 2, 10 seconds is a long time. In today's session, we're going to go through why this is so important from our perspective, where we're coming from and why we're bringing this today and why we continue to bring it back to ourselves, why I as a school leader continue to bring it back to myself. How? So a little bit around, we're going to share a tool with you, a resource that you can use to go about this work. And then what? What does this actually look like in practice? And I'll share some of the things from my own practice and from my school that have been helpful and that have been impactful. If you like to follow along, again, if you're someone who likes to think with your hands, take a minute on your piece of paper and actually draw your 3 circles. So draw your why, your how, and your what. And as things strike you today, we invite you to fill in these circles for yourself. You're obviously not turning this in at the end as an exit ticket, but just a space for you to stay organized and allow things to resonate, allow things to, maybe I want to come back to that later, or maybe this is a word that stood out, letting God talk to you through the presentation, and also just through your perspective today and a way to frame that.
Great. So as we enter into this first question of why, again, we think it's helpful to frame this conversation of leading with anti-racism in mind around our faith and who we are and our identities as Catholic educators. So to provide a frame and reflection for this, we're going to use the parable of the Good Samaritan. And we hope that this is helpful in 2 ways. First, for your own reflection here today and framing our conversation, but second, potentially as a reflection tool that you can use with your fellow educators, with your faculty in the future as you're continuing these conversations in your own school context. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to read this parable of the Good Samaritan to you. Maybe you've heard it before, maybe you've heard it many times before, but I'd ask that no matter how many times you've heard it, that you just listen as I'm reading through and take a moment to pick out any words, phrases, or moments from the parable that stand out to you. And if you're someone who likes to write, you can jot that down in your why circle, but just really take a moment to listen to this parable. So this is a reading from the Gospel according to Luke. But because he wished to justify himself, he said to Jesus, "And who is my neighbor?" Jesus replied, "A man fell victim to robbers as he went down from Jerusalem to Jericho. They stripped and beat him and went off, leaving him half dead. A priest happened to be going down that road, but when they saw him, he passed by on the opposite side. Likewise, a Levite came to the place, and when he saw him, he passed by on the opposite side. But a Samaritan traveler who came upon him was moved with compassion at the sight. He approached the victim, poured oil and wine over his wounds, and bandaged them. Then he lifted him up on his own animal, took him to an inn, and cared for him. The next day, he took out 2 silver coins and gave them to the innkeeper with instruction, 'Take care of him. If you spend more than what I have given you, I shall repay you on my way back.' Which of these 3, in your opinion, was neighbor to the robber's victim?" He answered, "The one who treated him with mercy." Jesus said to him, "Go and do likewise." So I'm going to give you just a few seconds here to finish jotting down any thoughts that stand out to you from that parable. So we hope that one of the things that is jumping out to you from this parable is this idea that our faith calls us to take the less convenient path. Certainly, it would be easy to be like the priest, like the Levite, to continue walking on our way. But our faith, as Christ shows us through this parable, calls us to be like the Good Samaritan, to take that less convenient path. It's a path that sometimes is going to take more time. The Samaritan certainly had to spend more time stopping to attend to this victim, taking him to the innkeeper. It might take more of our treasure, right, in paying the innkeeper for him staying there. It might take that accountability of going back and looking to see how the robber or how the victim of the robber was doing later on. So it is certainly less convenient, but that does not make it any less important, and really is the call that we are given through this parable by Christ. And so the question, as we're thinking about this in our frame today about leading with anti-racism in mind, then is, what does it look like to go down that less convenient path in building an inclusive and anti-racist school? What does that look like specifically for you? So I would encourage you to reflect on that and maybe jot down some notes on that thought as well. And another layer that we wanted to add to this was a reflection that Pope Francis shared in his recent encyclical Fratelli Tutti. And he shared this quote about the parable in which he said, "Each day we have to decide whether to be good Samaritans or indifferent bystanders." And I think this connects to our conversation today about leading with anti-racism in mind, because similarly, identities of being racist or anti-racist are not fixed identities, but an active choice that we have to make each day to actively be going about practices that are more inclusive, that are clearly anti-racist in our schools. And so we would really ask you to continue to think on, as we're entering into this conversation and our why, of what does it look like to actively be anti-racist each day in your own work, in your own school context. So with that, I'm gonna hand things back over to Clintel to get us a bit more into the how of how we going about do this.
Yes, and so when we think about the how, some key things are important around the learning, but also in how you approach this. And so first is building shared language amongst your team and community. The way that we are going to do this today is really by defining racism and anti-racism. While those are terms that are pretty common that we're hearing often, particularly in education spaces, not everyone comes in with the same understanding or definition of these terms. And so in order to move forward and go towards action, it's important to have a common understanding and definition. And so for racism, we describe and define racism as a system of disadvantage based on race. And so it cannot be fully explained as an expression of prejudice alone through interpersonal bias or decisions. This definition of racism is useful because it allows us to see that racism, like other forms of oppression, is not only a personal ideology based on racial prejudice, but a system involving cultural messages and institutional policies and practices, as well as the beliefs and actions of individuals. And so it's really key to remember that when we're talking about racism, we're thinking about systemic and structural racism as an institution, and really thinking about power and how that power is shared among different groups of people. And in our approach in being anti-racist, the goal is to ensure that that power is shared throughout. The next terms that are really part of the session's title that we're going to define here is anti-racism. And so when you think of anti-racism, you might think it's just the opposite of racism. But once again, it's key to then have that central definition of racism being associated with power to then define what anti-racism is. And so anti-racism is defined as the work of actively opposing racism by advocating for changes in political, economic, and social life. Anti-racism tends to be an individualized approach and set up in opposition to individual racist behaviors and impacts. And so understanding anti-racism, different folks are going to come in at different places. If you are a person of color, the work around anti-racism is a lot of the unlearning of internalized racism and white supremacy that we are socialized in today. If you are a white person, then that work is, again, unlearning to understand what ways are you perpetuating racism and how can you lead more effectively as an ally and a support. One key thing here, and what this chart is really showing, is whenever there are racial disparities, racism exists. And so being anti-racist means understanding that when you see racial disparities in society, whether we're looking at suspension rates in our schools or infant mortality rates nationally in the healthcare industry, if there is a racial disparity, then there is a direct cause. It is directly caused by either a system, a policy, a law, and we need to get things at the root to understand, well, what do we need to change in order to change that disparity, and not placing blame on the individuals who are experiencing that inequity. And so once you've had a shared definition and understanding of what is it that you're trying to do as an organization and what is the work you're trying to lead. A tool and framework that we like to use to help you navigate both that initial critical consciousness and awareness that you need as an individual to understand what are your biases, what is the unlearning that you need to do, all the way to what does the accountability need to look like in our organization to move forward is liberatory consciousness. This framework is developed by Dr. Barbara Love. And the quote here that we have here, we're just going to take a moment to have you all kind of simmer on it. And so liberatory consciousness enables humans to maintain an awareness of the dynamics of oppression characterizing society without giving in to despair and hopelessness about that condition. To maintain awareness of the role played by each individual in the maintenance of the system without blaming them for the roles they play, and at the same time practice intentionality about changing the systems of oppression. As you reread that quote and reflect, I want you to take a moment and possibly write down on your notes here, how does this quote apply to you as an individual? And how does it apply to your work as an educator? And so we'll take about 30 seconds for you to jot down some reflections before we move on. All right. And so what I'm going to do now is just take you through the steps of liberatory consciousness. And so there are 4 pillars of this framework that are awareness, analysis, action, and accountability. And we're going to take you through those really quickly. And so our first is awareness. And while with these 4 A's, you can go back and forth at any moment, you always need to start with awareness. This is so key and critical because awareness is all about noticing behaviors, thoughts, inequalities, and systems. And so the direct quote from Dr. Love is developing the capacity to notice, making the decision to live our lives from a waking position. And so this really is taking that step to look at disaggregated data, ask more rigorous questions of your practice and your systems to think, well, what is happening and what are the inequalities that are currently existing within our institution, within our community. Next, you go into analysis. And this is where you start to really ask critical questions around power and privilege to really understand what actions may be necessary to address the issue. So not only notice, but think and theorize, develop your own explanation for what is happening and why. And so an analysis portion might be looking at disparities that you see in students who are taking AP courses, and then taking that analysis to say, well, what is the circumstance of the group of students who are showing lower rates of participation? Is it, how are we presenting the opportunities to them? What are the courses entail? Are there costs involved? And so just asking as many questions as possible to see, can you get at the root of where that inequity or disparity is happening? Then the last 2 are action and accountability. And so often good intended people want to enact change, but they jump to action and accountability first. And so as you can see with the first 2, why it's important not to jump to action and accountability is because you may be doing an action that doesn't actually get to the root of the problem. And you can't know that unless you've done that analysis portion first. And so with action, there can be no division between those who think and those who put thinking into action. So deciding what needs to be done and see to it that that action is taken. Those actions can be a personal action for yourself that you need to take to move forward, or an institution-wide action that can be taken when you're thinking of a strategic plan or a strategic process and changing overall your organizational culture. Finally, accountability. You as all educators know that accountability is important in the same way that we expect our students to be able We have to set some systems in place for them, a deadline, a grading system. The same has to be done for the actions we take, particularly when it comes to diversity, equity, inclusion. And so putting accountability systems in place and prioritizing equity work. What's great about this framework is it can be used in a number of contexts. It can be used as a strategic planning process to first understand, well, where do you want to go? And then years later, as you're checking in on the status of your strategic plan, reassessing and going back, okay, let's look at the awareness and analysis pieces to understand what we might need to change to continuously improve. It's also can be really useful for individuals to really think through, maybe you're coaching a teacher who is learning on their path and really trying to have more of an inclusive classroom. Then you can still take the same 4 steps to understand, well, what specifically is going on with that teacher and the interactions with their students, and what are those unique actions that need to take for growth and learning moving forward. And so with the liberatory consciousness, we are going to pose these questions to you all and really understand that these are those starter questions to help you start this learning and development for diversity, equity, inclusion, and anti-racism within your institutions. And so we always want you to consider the following. What systems, policies, or practices in your immediate context are you aware of that are causing oppression? What are the root causes of this oppression manifesting itself in these systems, policies, or practices? What action can you take to combat this oppression? What opportunities are available to build collective action? And finally, how can you and others build sustained accountability and create change in the long term? Having this quote here from Dalai Lama, it is not enough to be compassionate, you must act. And so knowing, while we encourage reflection, and that's so key to get involved in this work first, that reflection is made more powerful once it is partnered with sustained action. And to show a little bit what this has looked like in practice, I'm going to pass it off to Betsy to share her experience with engaging in some of these practices and bringing anti-racism to her schools.
Thanks, Clintel. And a lot of what you'll see here is reflected in the liberatory consciousness framework. That was part of a training from Clintel and Liberated Consulting that my leadership team and I were able to attend almost a year ago now, maybe longer, maybe shorter. What is time these days? But really going through that process of looking at individual structures or pieces at our school and figuring out, where are we? You know, is this a place that really lacks awareness and we need to focus on awareness? Is this a place where we understand there's a problem, but we haven't thought it through? Really looking at where are we on that framework has helped us to do that piece of liberatory consciousness of holding ourselves accountable and really taking ownership without kind of dwelling in despair or you know, kind of I think that tension is really a challenging one as a school leader, is figuring out how we are making space for people to feel comfortable making mistakes and comfortable being vulnerable and comfortable with who we are, while also not making space for things that are reinforcing racist structures. And so really wading into that tension is what we've been doing, is what the work that we've been doing. And in terms of thinking about, you know, what does it mean to be anti-racist? Coming back to Taylor's story of the Samaritan, not Taylor's story, Jesus' story that Taylor shared with us of the Samaritan, and that we, Pope Francis's quote that on any given day, we make choices. Are we the neighbor today? Are we the passerby? Are we anti-racist today, or are we upholding systems of injustice? And so for me as a school leader, that's been thinking about identity and thinking about my identity as a white-bodied school leader and what that means to be anti-racist, to be an anti-racist school. What does that mean to want to build a school that is anti-racist in terms of the school that we impact the world with? What does that mean to be an anti-racist organism, meaning who we are as a school community, how we as adults relate to one another, as colleagues, what types of structures are we setting up within our school? And then also myself as an individual, how am I doing the work myself on myself? And also as a school leader, in the same way that we take responsibility for the faith development and personhood to make sure that the humans who have trusted us with their to be with us, that we're making space for them to grow as individuals as well. And so really just thinking through those three identities has been at the core of my work in terms of leading with anti-racism in mind, is continuing to come back to those three identities and asking myself, am I making active choices to be an anti-racist school? Am I making active choices to strive towards anti-racist organism? And am I making choices in myself to continue this work in myself? Again, owning, and I cannot restate that I am not an expert and I am not here to be an exemplar. I'm here to share with the hope that that as I have learned from others' examples, and I'm constantly getting ideas from other leaders, that perhaps this can spur some ideas in you and really just open the floor for these conversations. So in terms of as a school, so this is how I as a school leader have been looking at who we are as a school. So the bottom line is that schools are major players in the world, right? We're players in our neighborhoods. We're players, we make impact, we create impact. We are in a lot of ways external facing. And so when we think about who we are as a school, for my school, when we think of who we are as a school and are we an anti-racist school, a couple of the pieces that we push ourselves on, one is equity for students. So ensuring that students, regardless of background, regardless of skin tone, regardless of sort of how the world and structures shuffle us through, that there is equity for our students, that there is equity in terms of the education that we're providing, that we're cultivating change makers, so that we are ensuring that our students are going to go out, they're going to change the world. We need to make sure that they have all the tools that they need, that they have the consciousness that they need, and that they're amazing. That putting strong students and fueling them and tooling them for the world is a major part of what we do. And being really clear about our stance. We've pushed ourselves and grown in terms of saying the thing. Say the thing is a saying at my school. It means like, okay, you're thinking it, maybe you're making assumptions that this is a tough day for everyone because this thing happened. We've pushed ourselves as a school of saying and posting, this thing happened and it's not okay. And here's why it's not okay. And here's how it fits in our mission and our vision as a Catholic school, that it's not okay. We will continue to work for change and push for change. So those are a couple of ways that we as a school really push ourselves. Again, schools are major players. So we know we're a major player. Let's be an anti-racist major player in the world. In terms of thinking of who we are as an organism, right? Schools are organism. We relate to one another. We work together for our students, but we also work together with one another. And so thinking about our practices as an employer, thinking about our practices as networks of sort of co-learners, how we learn together, and making sure that we are an anti-racist organism in terms of the space that we're creating for other adults. So just a couple of examples of what that has looked like for us. One is searching for inequities within. So I'll share with you an example. At our school, we're a small Catholic school. Sometimes teachers call out. Sometimes people lose their prep times, right? It happens. If you are a Catholic school leader, I can see you through the computer nodding along with me. It happens. We try to prevent it. We try to protect our teachers' work time as much as we can, because that's part of our responsibility for them, but sometimes it happens. And being a small school, we had relied on relationships, and teachers might speak up and say, listen, it's been a really tough week for me. Is there any way I can get coverage? Is there anything that we can shuffle around? So we're doing that for a while. And then we started to realize, because we've been doing this liberatory consciousness work, that our white teachers were having more preps covered. And when we dug in and did our analysis, where we realized, or sort of our suspicion, our hypothesis, is that we were relying on people's comfort speaking up. And that's a power situation, and that's a comfort situation, and that's a relationship situation. And in digging into implicit bias, it's really easy for us to form these pathways with teachers, where certain teachers feel comfortable coming forward and others don't. And even if we've worked really hard to build a healthy and trusting environment, that was something that we noticed. And so we said, all right, we're going to make a policy around this. Like we're going to we're going to get a little bit more formalized in terms of checking in with people. We're going to ask the question. We're not, we are the leaders. We are in the position of power. So I'm going to ask, how was today for you? Did that work for you? Again, still relying on relationships to a certain amount, but starting the conversation and creating a space where we want that feedback. We want to hear back how we're doing. Making space to review policies. So things like hiring policies, dress code policies, things like that, making sure that we're making space for review and including various stakeholders in the conversations, and not just having them one time, but saying, okay, we're going to come back and review this policy in 3 years because it might work for us now, but it might not serve our needs in 3 years. So making space for those types of things. Courageous conversations. Towards the beginning, Clintel mentioned courageous conversations around the norms that were brought forward. There's it's a book and a PD series. It's a really excellent tool for facilitating conversations among adults and creating spaces of adults where we can have these courageous conversations and these difficult conversations. And then the last point here around us as an organism is balancing case studies with book studies. And the difference between these is when I mean a case study, I mean we as a full faculty are going to look at a case study together and we're going to debrief and we're going to talk about it and we're going to establish some things and wrestle with it. And then we also do book studies, which are for us opt-in. That doesn't mean you couldn't do an opt-in case study or a faculty-wide book study, but it was important to us to create space for both opt-in work for folks who maybe aren't as far along but are really eager for development or just want to take this further, but also to create space to say as leaders, listen, this is critical work. This is fundamental to what we do. As important as it is to have your teachers bought in on phonics before you roll it out, you wouldn't say like, this is best practices, but we're going to have people opt in to whether we're going to do this work or not. And so for us as a leader, as school leaders, thinking about what are the things that we want to do full school, like we're all diving into this and I'm making a statement as a leader that this is important, and what are the pieces where we want to do more of affinity groups or book studies or opt-in, or I'm sharing more posts or things where folks are able to be in control of their own development, and just the importance of partnering those two things because they're both important. And then finally, us as individuals. I remember, if you remember the book, The Life-Changing Magic of Tidying Up, in the intro section, the author speaks about, I know if you live with other people, the first thing you want to do is do a full family meeting and tell them how we're all going to do better, but start with yourself, tidy up for yourself. And so that is also an approach that I've tried to take around the work of anti-racism, is really looking at who I am as an individual. What do I need to learn? What do I need to unlearn? And it's not a one-day course. It's over and over and over again. Sometimes the same topic I need to read about and learn about and watch a video about and do a podcast and do a conversation before I'm really understanding how much I don't know or how much I need to unpack and unlearn. There's a lot of great resources out there. There's the 1619 Project you may have heard of. There's the Great Unlearn. I believe that's Rachel Elizabeth Cargill. Has an awesome 30-day course that you can do. There's Liberated Consulting, whose trainings I can't speak highly enough of, who make for great partners, right? We are not experts, but we shouldn't wait to feel like experts to start doing this work, because the experts are out there. And so we can partner with them. And again, just deeply engage in learning and unlearning. Just a couple of resources that I've found helpful. One of the resources that was shared from Liberated Consulting was around identifying white dominant culture and white supremacy culture, and how do you identify it in a workplace and how do you mitigate it? And just a couple of, and I've been able to come back to that resource again and again and just read it and find, okay, here's a small practice I'm going to add into my practice. Okay, here's a small practice that I'm going to add into my practice as a school leader. And I'll give you an example. One of the pieces that I identified for myself in reading this handout was around prevalence for the written word. dominance of the written word, believing, okay, it was in a memo, we're all responsible for it. You read the terms and conditions, you're responsible for it. If it's not in a memo, it's not as important. So again, just elevating the written word. And so I started making, part of my responsibility as a school leader is communication. I send out newsletters to parents. And so I started doing a video that accompanies every newsletter. So it was a small push for myself, but it was a push for myself. And every week when I made the video, it also just reminded me how far I have to go. That by taking this small step, I'm not like, oh, I'm done, I did the thing, but just that I can feel myself moving forward, and making it a more inclusive space for all of our families, for all of our students, for all of our employees. Decolonizing your feed. So there's a lot of, you may have heard, decolonize your curriculum, decolonizing your bookshelf, really just finding ways to make sure that the things, when I say feed, I mean like anything that's coming in your brain, making sure that you've expanded where you're getting content. So if you're following school leaders on Instagram, like I do, are you following school leaders of color? Or if you're into comedy, like is your comedy feed, again, that's a personal reference, is it decolonized? Just making sure that we are setting ourselves up to consume inclusively, so that as we lead, we are leading more inclusively. And then how to apologize. So Cheska Ramsey has an amazing 9-minute how to apologize video about how to apologize when you're called out. And I use it all the time. I 2 weeks ago needed to do a public apology with my staff for something that had happened on my watch that I'm responsible for. And before I did it, I rewatched that video. It's clean, it's easy, it's great. I highly recommend it. Because if you're gonna wade into this work and start to hold yourself accountable, you're going to have to apologize. There's gonna be things that you realize, harm that you've caused that you didn't realize that you were causing. And the only way to get to that accountable piece is to raise your awareness and do your analysis and take some action so that you can get to that space where we're able to hold ourselves and one another accountable and really bring about the kingdom, which is our call. So just taking a moment to bring it all together. We talked about the why, we talked about the what, we talked about the why, we talked about the how, we talked about the what. At the core, we're being called to be the neighbor in the Good Samaritan story. At the core, we're being called to not just walk past, right? This thing is happening, we see it happening. And so it's up to us to start to make decisions and not start that. When I say start, it makes an assumption that folks out there aren't doing amazing things. And I know that there are people who are in this session who are thinking, oh, I did that 3 years ago. I'm way over here now. And I think that's amazing. And so we invite this conversation and this continued reflection because none of us are done and we are unlikely to be done soon. And so I'm going to turn it back to Clintel to close us out a bit.
All right, and so we're gonna jump to Q&A in just a moment, but one thing we just wanna have you all do, because we know the importance of taking note of the questions and actions that you have, because we know you need to expect and accept non-closure, right? And so we want you to take a moment to take a note to yourself and jot down a question that you have after hearing today's content, a tension that you're wrestling with, and then finally an action that you're willing to take. And note with the actions, all actions are impactful. And so that action may be smaller and thinking about something you want to do on an individual level, or it might be going to your administrator and naming, okay, here's something I want to do. And so take a moment, write those down for yourself, and then we'll hop into some Q&A.
Great. So we hope that if you are jotting down some notes, please continue to do so. But with that, just really want to thank you for your time this afternoon and would like to open it up for any questions that we can answer.
Awesome. Quintella, Taylor, Betsy, thank you so much. Just before we jump into the Q&A for just a fantastic presentation, sort of the framework from what we know in terms of what our spirituality calls us to, what our faith calls us to, being able to have these workable frameworks and shared understandings, and then really actionable tips and resources to sort of lead with anti-racism in mind. So great stuff. Just an invitation to all of you that are watching along here and joining us for this session that you can use the questions or the messaging function to pose questions, raise comments. I know we've got a lot of requests for the slide deck and just the frameworks and the resources, so we'll make sure to share that out as soon as possible. So I want to start with just an initial question here. And I think just going back to the title, I'd like to open up to all three of you here. There's a difference between being not racist and anti-racist, right? Like that's a very critical distinction here. The session is really about leading with anti-racism in mind. So could the three of you sort of talk to, why do you think it's important for Catholic school leaders to be anti-racist rather than just not racist?
I can start if that's fine. And so the reason why is, so a lot of the framework around anti-racism comes from Professor Ibram Kendi. And one of the things that he names is that it's impossible to not be racist. And so saying you're not racist, like that isn't a thing. We all are on a journey towards being actively anti-racist. And so he uses that because the thought is everyone wants to jump to, I'm not racist, when someone's calling something out to them that potentially is racist. And what that does is create this false dichotomy that there's good people in the world who are not racist and bad people in the world who are racist. And that's false. That's not the reality in which we live. There's good and bad people all over who have all types of views and biases, and that's okay because that's human nature. The thing that's important is to think about, well, what are you going to do to move forward in order to be a better person for everyone that you interact with from different backgrounds? And that is where we're looking at anti-racism. Because if you're anti-racist, if someone's going to tell you, hey, this thing offended me or made me uncomfortable, or that was racist, then you're not going to be, oh, I'm not racist. What you will do instead and say is, thank you, I did not know. I'm now going to do some learning so that I can continue to be actively anti-racist in the future and not continue the behavior that I'm just learning today was racist. And that's okay. I think we're in a place where that is ultimately where we all want. We just know that we're on a journey of growth. And the idea here is to understand that we want to stop the shaming around like being racist and understand that actually, we just all want to be on the journey to understand how we can be anti-racist together in the same way that we know that none of us are perfect in even our faiths, but we're constantly on a journey to be as best as we can and ensure that we're living up to those values.
Great. Got a great question here. There was a little bit about sort of talking about awareness, and I think blind spots when you're trying to lead with an anti-racist framework and mindset. I think it's so important to sort of unearth those blind spots. So there's a great question here. What are some of the harms Catholic school leaders might be doing currently as far as, I think, perpetuating racism in their leadership, and not realizing that they're doing these things? So what are some of these sort of common blind spots, and what did you find they were doing to sort of embed maybe I think racist outcomes in school?
Clintel, you work with leaders all over the country. I know you just fielded that last one, but you probably have a sense of the landscape. Could you share what some folks have shared with you?
Sure. And so kind of what Betsy named is we work with a lot of religious schools in our work. And oftentimes I think some of those blind spots or barriers truly can be not taking the time to look at that data, disaggregate it, and just view like, well, we care for all children, and all children are welcome in this space, and kind of just prescribing to that is usually the first misstep, is because it's, once again, we're not talking about your individual beliefs or how you are individually operating, but understanding that there are systems that have been created by people who did not have the same all children belief as you, that we are still using and enacting in our schools. And so it's important to interrogate those and understand that while we may hope and want to be a place where all children can learn. Historically, our institutions have not been set up in that way. And I think that's the like top thing. I know it's not like a direct like practice or policy, but I think it's the mindset around, well, we don't see color. That is usually the like biggest hurdle to get over. Is it's not a shame to see color. It's not a bad thing. It's good. The issue is in if you're seeing it and then having a negative connotation associated with it.
Mhm.
Great. Here's another question, and this is a fascinating one, right? So this is working with parents, right? Because we want to make sure that this extends throughout the whole culture. So here's the question. The question is, how do we deal and explain to parents who do not want this in the school or in the classroom because they believe it is quote unquote political?
Yeah, that's real. That's real. I think, it's hard. I mean, that's at the root of a lot of things that are hard. I think that in the same way that if someone were, I was in a conversation with school leaders yesterday around folks who were receiving feedback that they should quote be less Catholic, or that they should, like when we hear that, we sort of like no, like that's who we are at our core. I think that it's really, really hard, but one is recognizing that like this is our call. This is what God's calling us to right now. There's great Catholic scholars out there right now, a lot of religious brothers, sisters, priests who have some really great writing, and I think doing some like inviting some readings in on some of these different things. We've started doing where we sort of like spotlight out some articles from sources who aren't us, who aren't me. It's not me running the school. It's like, let's read what this priest has to say and let's like unpack it a little bit, or kind of deferring out can sometimes be helpful for someone who's used to like a hierarchical structure. And so I think just continuing to bring it back to this is our call.
Yeah, and I would just quickly add the way that Betsy named, like bringing in the community into the learning. And so that's a key first step. But then the other thing is, in saying that this is political, I think it also needs to be addressed that education itself has never been apolitical. Like teaching is not a neutral act. Throughout our history, we have like folks want to say that anti-racist education is indoctrinating students, but we have been indoctrinating students in the United States for decades. It has been just one point of view and perspective that has been highlighted. And so what anti-racist education and inclusive education is trying to do is present the opportunity to learn about other people's stories, other people's histories, and understand that there are many ways to navigate this world and expressing who you are, and that is okay. And in particular, when we think about our Catholic schools, kind of understanding that that is also okay to God, and understanding that Christ is going to accept you, and that is a path forward that we want to do.
Good stuff. I hope you're okay with all taking a couple more questions. We're getting some great questions here in the chat. Before I jump into the next question, I want to read something that was not a question, but I guess they were just giving you props here. And it was, I'm not sure how to make this into a question, but I work with a lot of immigrant and refugee populations, and I find that this approach to anti-racism is a great tool for approaching learned bias and racism with these groups who don't have the history of American racism. So this is just Morgan Moore saying that she loved the approach in the language that you've all used. So quick props there. All right, so let's flip back over to actual questions.
Let's just do more questions like that. Let's just
not questions. We're just gonna keep sort of, yeah. Awesome. Okay, so this is from James Ryan. So the question here is, how can we engage all stakeholders to work towards an anti-racist school community? So this is sort of pinning on to the parent question, but I think broadening it. And then it's, additionally, how can people in power, so school leaders, teachers, broach these ideas with families and church partners in a genuine way? So how do we get this to be sort of a collective whole community effort?
I'll just share really quickly. I think the first step is really defining what it is for your context. And so the reason why that defining is so important is because before you can bring folks along on the journey, once again, everyone has assumptions about what you're doing. And so being very clear and having that message laid out, or the policy very clear, so that as you engage other folks, no one's making assumptions in what you're trying to do. It's very clear when we're talking about inclusive environments, here's what that means. When we're talking about anti-racist education, this is what that looks like. Then you can start the conversations with various stakeholders. The second piece I'll just name is that it's critical to have all of your stakeholders engage in this learning, because once again, we know that power dynamic exists. And so you may have all of your administration team on the same page, but maybe your boards are not if you have boards in schools. And so then it's like, well, our administration just went through this learning, but our boards did not. And so making sure that every stakeholder across the organization has this opportunity for learning and engaging in robust dialogue.
Yeah. I think if I can just build on that,
Sure.
is I think one of the strategies that we use a lot with really all levels of stakeholders is assuming the best, and starting from shared understanding. You know, if they're involved in your school, then there's a shared belief system somewhere. And so I think starting from that, like what's the shared, and a lot of schools, you know, we all have our different catchphrases, right? Like students come first, or God, family, school, you know, like things that, like starting from those things that feel very true for your school, and starting from a place of, I know we all believe X. And sort of like starting from there can be really helpful. And then sharing, you know, from my perspective, the phrase from my perspective is a really helpful one, because that's all any of us is ever sharing, right? But a lot of times we don't name it as such. And so starting from understanding, if you're just helping like individuals unpack things, especially, but with I'm thinking about our board in particular, some of that work. There's also an intervention that's actually from some of the growth mindset work from David Yeager, who's also an ACE grad. And he always would say, saying is believing. And so if you want to help shift folks' minds, get them involved in shifting other people's minds, because saying helps shift, like saying is believing. And so we've done some work with like, you know, okay, we all believe this because of this, then this, because of this, then this, and here's a place where we're seeing this discongruity. Board members go out and fundraise, they talk to other people who run in their circles, and getting them involved in like, how can we help people learn and unlearn? How can we help people shift their language? Because right now the language is harmful, but the intent is good. So how can we help people own their language? Those types of things. So I think that piece of like assuming the best and starting from shared understanding, and then getting people involved in an empowering way can be helpful as well.
That's awesome. It's very much like a talk the walk, right? Like it's, you use the language and you use that repetition of sort of like, let's construct the narrative first with our words, and then have our actions sort of follow it, and use that constant monitoring of the two to make sure that things are in alignment. So good stuff here.
I was just going to ask Taylor, I know you work with a lot of folks in a lot of different levels of Catholic education with your work through ACE Advocates. Is there anything you would add here?
Yeah, I would just say, would love to reiterate what Clintel shared of like our own experience of doing this type of work with our graduates, that really we had to define who are those stakeholders, who are we trying to reach, what are going to be kind of their individual perspectives that they're bringing to this work, and like goals that they're hoping, ways that they're hoping to grow through this. And I think coming in with that clear definition of that might look different if we're talking about our students versus our teachers versus our board members, and for us, you know, even broader of those who are supporting Catholic education, but really thinking about that before you engage in the work. I think it goes back to like getting to those early steps of our liberatory consciousness before we jump into the action.
So I hope you guys don't mind. There are two really good questions that I want to close out with, and then we can end it. We're going to go a little bit over like the hour time, but look, hey, we're not running into anything else, so let's just take what we can get, right? I like this. I love this question here. I wish I had seen it sooner, because I think it's great. And Clintel in particular, like when you were talking about saying like, hey, let's look at the data, let's use like constant analysis of data and of all kinds to be able to sort of engage in this work. Eileen Wilkinson's question is this. She says, or she asks, what do you suggest when a policy seems equitable, but the results shows an inequality? How do you tackle that?
Yeah, I would say, you know, go back to that framework with the awareness analysis, because most likely the policy was enacted to address a false root cause, which means that the intention was fine, but it didn't quite get at what was actually producing the inequity in the first place. And so that's why going back and forth to just go back to, okay, awareness. You've already started that. You understand that the policy is now causing more inequity. Now get into that analysis portion to really dig deep. And I think what's important to understand with this process is it doesn't need to happen just to people who are in positions of power. This process is intended to be community driven as well. And so you may have questions that you don't have answers to. And so you now need to go out to parents, to students, to teachers to get the answers to those questions before you move forward with that action.
Mm-hmm.
Awesome. All right. I think if I can find it, this will be the last question. And this is important too, because I'm thinking about, how, we have close to 6,000 Catholic schools in the United States. And, we have schools like St. Malachi in Independence, in the mission school in Philadelphia, serving a majority minority population. But then we have schools like, I think Rona is asking this question. So what approach, or how do you start educating others to be self-aware of anti-racism when you work in, she was mentioning a small community group with a minority rate of less than 10%. So how do you sort of embed anti-racism into your practice as a leader to facilitate those conversations if you don't have that diversity in your community?
We can all see each other and we can see each other.
Yeah, everybody was just like,
just sharing a very limited perspective, but my husband and I work at very different Catholic schools that serve very different populations. And it's been really interesting, especially over this last year, as awareness has grown. The problem has not grown. The awareness of the problem has grown, and I think sharpened in many communities that maybe were less aware. And it's been really interesting because it's different, the work looks different. And I think where we might fall on that trajectory can be different, or what it means in each of those trajectories could be different. Again, just a very limited perspective. I think a lot of times you're going back to those three different identities of school, organism, self. That also figuring out, like, in which of those pods do you want to do the most work, because it might be that you have a position to do some impact in the world. If you're feeling like it's harder to find inequities within your community, but your community is perhaps representative of a bigger inequity, then there's perhaps some external work that you could do. If your school, like many Catholic schools, has service hours, making sure that those service opportunities are not exploitive or are not reinforcing. Again, I'm just pulling from very like my dinner table conversations, but it can be very different based on the like what work needs done.
Yeah, I would say the difference is, are you trying to do something urgent to change your current context because you are disadvantaging or perpetuating oppression for a target group within your school institution? And if not, then the work is, okay, well, what type of students are we trying to educate? What type of values do we want them to have and lead with as they go on into society and their ongoing careers? I think really grounding any anti-racism work in the 7 key themes of Catholic social justice teaching is a really strong avenue and pathway forward, because like that is just connected with the faith. That's not actually saying, well, if you teach all Black and brown kids, this is what you do. No, that's for everyone. And I think that's what's key here, is that just because this is why it's not interpersonal bias and understanding the systems, because you can not interact with a single person of color, maybe all your life, just given your context and where you live. It still doesn't mean that your daily actions or the things that you encounter in the world doesn't have an impact on others. And so I think really teaching students with that mindset so that they understand empathy and a want to help others, even if something feels or seems like it doesn't relate to them, is truly key and important.
That's fantastic. I love that you mentioned the 7 themes of Catholic social teaching, because Sue de Tomaso, who's listening in and attending, she was like, yeah, I find, using the 7 themes of Catholic social teaching to be a great way to, as Betsy was saying, like, how do we, let's start from shared understanding. Let's start from our common ground and let's build our framework of dialogue and encounter that way. We are like 14 minutes past our allotted time, but that just says something about the content that's presented here. All of you that are watching, in your homes, in your schools, in your offices, wherever you might be. So thank you. And then our thanks as NCEA to you, Clintel, and to Taylor and Betsy. Any last things you want to leave us with before we sign off?
Before we do last words, John, do you mind if I just put up our how to contact us real quick?
Yeah, there's a ton of people that I'm sure are super excited.
I'm just going to do a quick share screen because, again, going back to Clintel through Liberated Consulting and Taylor through ACE Advocates, they support schools across the country. And if this is work that you're interested in, partnering is one of the best moves that you can make. So feel free to we've all got I know we cleared our decks, but you can grab your phone, take a quick screenshot. And then just want to say thank you to everyone for joining today. Thank you, John, for facilitating. Thanks, NCEA. And thank you, Taylor and Clintel. I'm so grateful.
Thanks all. Really great.
Right. And with that, we will conclude this session. Thank you so much for attending this live session at NCEA 2021 entitled Leading with Anti-Racism in Mind. In a brief moment, you're going to see a session evaluation pop up on your screen. Make sure to respond to fill it out. First off, that feedback helps us, helps our presenters know how to better serve you and minister to you in your work in Catholic schools. And second, it's important for you in terms of tracking your engagement and participation here at NCEA 2021. Know that all sessions are recorded and archived and will be available through the end of June. So if you want to go back and revisit this and other great sessions, you can do that at your own leisure, at your own time. As we wrap up day 2 of NCEA 2021, we just want to say thanks, and we will see you tomorrow. Have a great one.